She had a first-class ticket, a multimillion-dollar deal in her handbag, and still, they looked at her like she didn't belong. At Gate 32 of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, a black CEO was told, "This lane is for first-class passengers." What they didn't know, she was the reason first class even existed on that flight. And with one phone call, she didn't just board the plane, she brought the entire airline to its knees. If you believe real power doesn't need to scream to be heard, this story is for you. Before most travelers had even finished their morning coffee, Danielle Pierce walked into the check-in zone of Gate 32, heels clicking softly across the polished airport floor. It was just after 6:15 a.m., and the sun was barely stretching its rays across the tarmac. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had fought her way into rooms where no one had saved her a seat. At 38 years old, Danielle was the founder and CEO of Pierce Harvest Logistics, a major supplier of clean, traceable produce across the Midwest and Southeast. A single mother, a businesswoman, and the reason Horizon Air had survived one of its biggest food service PR disasters just a few months ago. But this morning at Hartsfield-Jackson, she wasn't thinking about strategy meetings or media turnarounds. She was thinking about her speech at the Southern Food Sustainability Forum in San Francisco. A folded printout of that speech was tucked in her coat pocket. A $48 million contract, signed, sealed, and active, was quietly resting inside her aged leather handbag, a gift from her son on her last birthday. And in her hand, a perfectly legitimate first-class boarding pass. She approached the check-in counter with calm energy. The waiting area was mostly empty, aside from a few early travelers shuffling toward the coffee kiosks, dragging wheeled suitcases behind them. The line at Gate 32 wasn't long. As she reached the counter, Danielle offered a polite nod to the uniformed woman behind it. "Good morning," Danielle said softly. The employee, a young white woman named Brittany Wells, freshly transferred from Tulsa just a few weeks ago, barely looked up before grabbing the boarding pass. She scanned the name, her eyes flickering briefly, then did a double take. Her gaze traveled from the ticket to Danielle, and back, and then again. That look, it wasn't unfamiliar to Danielle. She had seen it dozens of times over the years, measuring, doubting, suspicious. Brittany didn't offer a greeting. No smile. Just a sharp inhale and an eyebrow arch that said more than words ever could. She finally spoke, her tone wrapped in fake politeness and cold protocol. "This line is for first-class passengers, ma'am." Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. "I know," she replied calmly, her voice steady and low. There was no sarcasm, no raised tone, just truth. The kind that doesn't need decoration. For a brief moment, the air around the counter thickened. Not with tension, but with something deeper, a collision of perception and power. Anyone nearby might have felt it. That slight chill in the air? It wasn't from the airport vents. It was the presence of someone who had spent her entire adult life disproving assumptions and had never once lost her dignity doing so. Brittany's fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't move. Her eyes locked on Danielle, as if she were waiting for proof that the woman in front of her didn't belong here. Because in her mind, something just didn't add up. Well-dressed? Yes. Polished? Absolutely. But not the kind of first-class Brittany had been trained to expect. Not the Gucci-laced, hedge fund type. Not the platinum blonde socialite or the Armani briefcase guy who wore his entitlement like a cologne. And not black. Certainly not black. So she hesitated. Danielle, meanwhile, simply adjusted the silk scarf around her neck and waited. Not impatiently. Not defensively. Just waited. Because she'd done this before. Years ago in Dallas, she'd been stopped at a luxury hotel ballroom and denied access to a food industry summit, despite being the keynote speaker. In Houston, she was asked if she was the delivery woman after inking a major vendor deal. And more times than she could count, she was offered the clipboard at board meetings, not the chair at the table. Today was no different. Only the backdrop had changed. Brittany still hadn't scanned the ticket. She shifted slightly, glancing toward the back of the counter where a uniformed airport security guard stood beside the baggage scanner. She didn't raise her voice, didn't call for backup, but the signal was there. A slight nod, a sideways glance, a motion so subtle it could be mistaken for habit, unless you were watching closely. Brittany was stalling, and Danielle knew it. She felt it in her bones. The familiar sting of being doubted, of having to prove what was already obvious. "May I see your ID, please?" Brittany finally asked. Danielle's expression didn't change. Without saying a word, She reached into her coat and pulled out her Ohio driver's license, laying it gently on the counter. Brittany picked it up and stared at it for longer than necessary. But still, she didn't scan the boarding pass. She didn't type in the name. She just stood there, letting time stretch, letting tension settle like dust. Then, she reached for her walkie-talkie and whispered something under her breath. Moments later, a tall man in a Horizon security jacket walked over. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say hello. He just positioned himself next to Danielle like she was some sort of security concern. Still, Danielle remained composed. She didn't argue. She didn't sigh. She didn't even glance at the guard. She pulled out her phone, searched a name, dialed. 1 ring. 2. Maggie, it's me. Pull up the Horizon contract, the $48 million one. Yes, for the Western flight routes. I'm at gate 32 in Atlanta. Looks like they need a reminder. There was silence on the other end, then the calm voice of her assistant. I'm on it. Want me to loop in Calvin Hartley? Not yet. Just flag it. Let's see how long it takes them to figure it out. She hung up, still holding her unscanned first-class ticket. Still standing still. Still not moving. Behind her, the crowd of passengers began to grow. Some started whispering. What's going on? Did she do something? Maybe she forged the ticket. Danielle heard every word, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Because what they didn't realize was that she wasn't trying to force her way in. She was already in. She was the reason the first-class cabin even had new food trays. The reason the airline was recovering from a brand disaster. The reason they had a shot at competing again. And all of that was sitting quietly in a leather bag, while the woman who made it happen stood still, watching a flawed system unravel itself. Danielle Pierce stood at gate 32 of Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson airport, perfectly composed, while a security officer hovered beside her like she was on a watch list. Her boarding pass remained unswiped, her ID untouched on the counter, and her presence, silent yet unmistakable, was creating tension thicker than the Georgia humidity outside. Inside her head, she wasn't thinking about confrontation. She was calculating, not how to lash out, but how to let the system undo itself. Across the city in a quiet home office, Maggie Owens, Danielle's executive assistant of 7 years, had just opened the encrypted contract folder marked Horizon Air Confidential, Fresh Horizons Initiative. She didn't hesitate. She'd seen this before. Not with this airline, not at this scale, but she'd witnessed Danielle walk into meetings and get called the assistant, the intern, or the delivery woman. And each time, the result was the same. Danielle didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. Maggie drafted a quick internal alert. No dramatic subject line. Just facts. Urgent. Celeste Morgan, contract name VIP passenger being held at ATL Gate 32. $48 million active contract. Request internal flag to regional, brand crisis, and exec food service. She hit send. Recipients, Calvin Hartley, VP of Food and Experience. Ava Lynn, Regional Operations Director. Lisa Moreno, Horizon's Legal Liaison. Back at Gate 32, Brittany Wells, still standing behind the counter, pretending to check the system, had no idea she had just set off a chain reaction inside the airline's highest levels. But Danielle knew. She could feel the energy shifting, the whispers growing, the curiosity evolving into subtle judgment. I bet she's trying to sneak in. Probably used miles or a reward pass. She doesn't look like first class. The last line stung, not because it was new, but because it never went away. Danielle had heard it dressed up in corporate language. Not the image we usually present. Our clients expect a different style. Let's circle back. Maybe another quarter. Brittany didn't scan the ID. Instead, she glanced again toward the security officer, who remained next to Danielle like a mannequin in a uniform, silent, imposing, and unnecessary. Danielle, standing still, glanced at her watch. 6:41 a.m. 14 minutes had passed since her ticket was first taken. In the world of corporate aviation, that was a lifetime, especially when the woman being delayed happened to be the architect of the airline's meal revamp across all long-haul domestic routes. Brittany still hadn't realized who she was dealing with, but someone upstairs had. At Horizon's Atlanta regional office, Ava Lynn was sipping her first cup of black tea when her assistant walked in and handed her a printed email flagged red. Ava frowned. She read the subject line, then the contract name, then the words, being held at Gate 32. She stood up mid-sip. Get Calvin Hartley. Now. 10 floors above Gate 32, inside the sleek Horizon Operations Wing, Calvin, director of food experience, was reading through a logistics chart for the rollout of the company's Fresh Horizons campaign. The irony wasn't lost on him when Ava walked in and said, "The woman responsible for saving this campaign is being profiled at the gate." He blinked. "Danielle Pierce." Ava nodded. "They haven't scanned her ticket. Security's been called. No one knows who she is." Calvin cursed under his breath, grabbed his coat, and bolted. Meanwhile, at the gate, Brittany tapped half-heartedly at her keyboard, still trying to find an excuse. Any excuse. She wasn't malicious. But she was conditioned. Conditioned to think that someone like Danielle couldn't possibly hold the power to change how airlines serve food. Couldn't possibly hold a multi-million-dollar contract. Couldn't possibly belong in 1A. And yet, here she was, standing calm, holding the system by the thread of her silence. Danielle's phone buzzed. Maggie sent the alert. "Ava and Calvin are in motion. Legal is on standby. You just became their crisis." Danielle typed back one line. "Good. Let them catch up to the truth." Behind her, the crowd had doubled. Business travelers with carry-ons. A family with sleepy kids. A man loudly chewing gum and watching Danielle like she was the halftime show. Still, no one asked questions. No one challenged the process. Because the uniform meant it must be justified. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, glanced up at the gate screen. Flight 1884 to San Francisco, on time. The irony was almost poetic. She was the reason that route had a new culinary supplier. The reason the airline had climbed out of a month-long PR nightmare involving gray meat, frozen peas, and a viral TikTok where a first-class passenger slammed a meal tray into the floor yelling, "This isn't food, it's punishment." That video had cost Horizon $7.2 million in canceled bookings and lost reputation. Danielle Pierce was their solution. But today, she was being treated like a security risk because a 20-something boarding agent from Tulsa thought her confidence looked suspicious. Inside Horizon's legal office, Lisa Moreno, crisis lead counsel, received Maggie's flagged message. Her reaction was clinical. "We're exposed." "To what?" an analyst asked. "To someone who doesn't shout, doesn't sue, but knows exactly how to collapse us in one sentence." At 6:55 a.m., back at the terminal, Calvin Hartley burst through the internal side of the security hall and stepped into view just outside Gate 32. He scanned the area. It wasn't hard to spot her. Danielle stood like a monument, unmoving, undisturbed. Calvin felt a sudden heat in his throat. This was no longer a customer experience issue. This was a full-scale reputational meltdown in progress. He approached the counter. Brittany looked up and visibly stiffened when she saw the Horizon executive badge on his chest. "Ms. Wells," he said, his tone level but sharp. "Why, yes." He pointed toward Danielle. "Did you stop this passenger?" "She? I was just verifying her credentials." "You were supposed to verify the ticket." "I was just following instinct," she mumbled. Calvin turned toward Danielle. "Ms. Pierce," he said, bowing his head slightly. "I am so sorry. Please, come with me." Danielle didn't move right away. She looked at Brittany, not with anger, with something worse, clarity. "This was never about the procedure," she said softly. "It was about a look." Brittany didn't respond. She didn't have to. Her silence was already louder than any defense she could offer. Danielle turned and walked beside Calvin toward the executive lounge. The security guard? Gone without a word. The whispers? Suddenly dead quiet. But the lesson? Just beginning. Because the quietest moment in the airport wasn't when Danielle walked away. It was when the check-in agent finally looked down and realized. She had tried to block the one person who had rebuilt the foundation they were standing on. And Danielle hadn't even raised her voice. She had simply made the right call and let the weight of the truth do the rest. As Danielle Pierce followed Calvin Hartley into the private lounge adjacent to Gate 32, her heels clicked with the same steady rhythm as when she entered the terminal that morning. But inside her, something far older had been stirred. Not rage, not vengeance, something deeper. Memory. She didn't need this walk to remind her of who she was. But for some reason, with every step down that sterile hallway, framed with glossy airport ads promising luxury and exceptional service, her mind didn't go to the present. It drifted backward to Cleveland. To mornings colder than this one, back when she was 9 years old, bundled in an oversized coat 2 sizes too big, clutching the fabric of her mother's jacket as they walked down cracked sidewalks toward a small neighborhood grocery on Euclid Avenue. The streets still smelled like salt from the plows. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the world had already started moving. Her mother, Louise Pierce, was a clerk at the market. Technically, her job title was store associate, but she was more than that. She stocked shelves. She sorted produce. She managed the tiny checkout register and gave credit to neighbors when they couldn't pay in full. They called her Miss Louise, and when she spoke, people listened. But every morning before the store opened, Danielle and her mother carried crates of cabbage, apples, potatoes, from the delivery truck to the produce section. Some days, her fingers froze stiff. Some days, she nearly dropped the wooden boxes on the tile floor. But she never complained, because every grunt, every lifted crate, came with a lesson. Don't just look at what's in the basket, Louise would whisper. Look at who it's for. Look them in the eye. Know what matters to them. Danielle didn't learn business from textbooks. She learned it between rinds and roots. She learned that when a customer hesitated between two melons, her mother didn't say, pick one. She picked up both, tapped gently with her knuckles, sniffed the skin, smiled, and said, this one. It caught more sun. It'll be sweeter today. It was care. Not performance. Not branding. Just care. And that stayed with Danielle. Long after high school. Long after Kent State University, where she studied agricultural business while working nights at a cold storage warehouse, stacking pallets of carrots and corn and arugula at 3 a.m. While her classmates chased internships at Fortune 500 firms, Danielle saved $300 in cash from part-time shifts and bought an old blue Ford pickup from a retired farmer. She didn't start with a staff. She didn't have a trust fund. She had a whiteboard, a folding table, and a dream. The first version of Pierce Harvest Logistics was nothing more than a roadside vegetable stand in Akron. She wrote her slogan by hand on plywood. Fresh from field to fork in 24 hours. People laughed. Some drivers rolled their windows up. One man even leaned out and said, a black girl in a pickup talking about food safety? You lost. Danielle smiled. And then, the next morning at 4 a.m., she was back on the road, picking up produce straight from the farm. She washed each radish herself, sorted every bunch of kale, and when she delivered orders to restaurants and local groceries, she handwrote thank you notes on recycled brown paper. Still, the big chains ignored her until she found the gap. You see, while major food suppliers were chasing high-end, overpriced organic products for the ultra-rich, Danielle focused on a different question. What if clean food didn't have to be exclusive? She started visiting small farms across Ohio, Amish-owned lots, Vietnamese co-ops, Black-owned produce lands. She didn't come with brochures or quotas. She came with trust. Switch to GAP standards, she'd say. I'll help you sell every carrot. Some farmers laughed. Others listened. But the few who partnered with her saw something miraculous. The food they grew finally ended up on plates that mattered. Within 3 years, Danielle had built a local logistics network that bypassed traditional distributors. She made deals with independent schools, university dining halls, and one hospital chain that had seen a rise in food waste lawsuits. By year 7, her startup was supplying clean, locally sourced meals to 34 retail chains, 5 regional hospital networks, and 3 airline vendors. But none of that came easily. When she showed up at a retail office to pitch a deal, she was told to use the back entrance. Deliveries go in the back. She wasn't making a delivery. She was bringing a new model of nourishment. When she walked into a car dealership to look at a hybrid van for expanding routes, a smiling saleswoman ushered her toward the used lot. This model's usually for commercial clients. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Good. Because I am a commercial client. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She signed the paperwork, drove away, and never looked back. Now, 15 years after that hand-painted plywood sign, Danielle Pierce was the name behind one of the most respected clean food suppliers in the country. And when Horizon Air, after being roasted online for their subpar meals, needed a game changer, they didn't go to the flashy food tech bros with urban lofts. They called Danielle, not because she had a perfect pitch deck, but because when she showed up to their 18th floor conference room in Dallas, she didn't bring a PR team. She brought produce. Cherry tomatoes from Indiana. Whole grain bread from Missouri. Cilantro that smelled like it had just been plucked from the earth. This isn't a sample, she said. This is the standard. She proposed a full overhaul of Horizon's in-flight meals, fresh, regional sourcing, direct-to-farm contracts, no middlemen, biodegradable packaging, seasonal menus. Her plan would reduce food waste, save over $1.2 million in disposal fees, and drop customer complaints by nearly half. They signed in less than a week. A $48 million contract, the largest sustainability overhaul in Horizon's history. And she still refused to appear in their promo video. "Don't put my face on the trays," she told their marketing team. "Put better food on them instead." So now, here she was, at the airport, holding a first-class ticket for the very airline she had helped repair. Delayed, questioned, watched, not because she was unknown, but because someone looked at her and saw the wrong thing. That's when the irony hit. Danielle had spent 2 decades removing rot from food systems, but never expected she'd need to do the same with airport counters. The rot wasn't always in the crates. Sometimes it was in the gaze. The look that asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Even when you built the place. Back inside the private executive lounge of Gate 32, Danielle Pierce sat upright in a beige leather chair, her boarding pass still untouched on the table beside her. Across from her, Calvin Hartley, Horizon's Director of Food and Customer Experience, was pacing, not frantically, but with that peculiar rhythm that only shows up when a person realizes they've stumbled into a disaster they should have seen coming. "Danielle," he began, "we're going to fix this." Immediately, Danielle didn't respond. She simply raised an eyebrow and crossed her legs with quiet precision. She wasn't here for promises. She had heard those before, from suppliers who didn't pay farmers, from retailers who mislabeled her products, from executives who promised reform but only offered headlines. And this wasn't a fix-it moment. This was a reckoning. Outside, the boarding gate remained frozen. A whisper of awkward energy hung in the air like airport humidity. Travelers had started checking their phones. Some scrolled through flight updates. Others glanced toward the check-in counter, where Brittany Wells now stood pale and stiff as marble. She had just learned who Danielle was, and the color drained from her face the moment Mia, a fellow agent, approached her holding a printed document. "You stopped Danielle Pierce," Mia whispered. I didn't know. She's the CEO of Pierce Harvest. You know, the clean food supplier we just signed that massive contract with? She feeds our first-class cabins." Brittany blinked. "I thought." She just didn't look. She caught herself. But the damage was already done. The sentence she didn't finish was louder than anything she could have said. Back in the lounge, Danielle finally spoke. "Do you know what seat I was assigned?" Calvin nodded. 1A. Danielle's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Interesting. Because I was told that lane was only for first-class passengers." It wasn't sarcasm. It was a scalpel, sharp, precise, and cutting directly into the hollow core of Horizon's culture. Calvin sat down, suddenly aware of how small the room felt. "I can assure you, we're addressing it. I've already spoken to our legal department and regional ops. Cynthia Reyes is on her way here personally." Danielle let the silence hang for a second longer before replying. "Good. Because I don't need an apology, Calvin." "You don't?" "No. I need an explanation." Her tone wasn't angry. It was calm. But in that calmness was a gravity that made even the clock on the wall seem like it ticked slower. Outside, the whispers grew louder. Someone recognized her. A man in a gray blazer with a Bluetooth earpiece whispered to his colleague, "That's the farm-to-plane lady. I saw her on the sustainability panel last quarter." A woman wearing Louboutin heels glanced at Danielle through the lounge window and muttered, "If she's first class, why'd they hold her up? She looks normal." Normal. As if excellence had a uniform, as if competence wore a skin color. As if success had a hairstyle and a speech pattern. Danielle heard none of it. But she didn't need to. She'd heard it her entire life, in different flavors, from different lips. Meanwhile, inside Horizon's Northeast headquarters in Midtown Atlanta, Cynthia Reyes was racing through internal channels. Emails were flying. Calls were skipped in favor of direct messages flagged with red urgency. Maggie Owen's message had reached her first. Danielle Pierce being profiled at ATL Gate 32. $48 million contract. Possible optics crisis. Recommend direct involvement. Cynthia didn't wait. Get Justin Cole from legal. And Elise from brand crisis. Now, ma'am, they're in the budget. I don't care if they're negotiating the Pentagon. Pull them. She was in a suit jacket before the call ended, storming down the hall with the kind of purpose that made interns step out of her way instinctively. This wasn't about reputation anymore. This was about integrity. And more dangerously, exposure. At gate 32, Brittany hadn't moved. She was staring blankly at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard but frozen in guilt. You need to go talk to her, Mia said. I can't. Why? Because anything I say now will sound like damage control. And she wasn't wrong. Because what could she say? I didn't scan your ticket because I didn't expect you to belong here. I called security because I trusted my instinct more than your documentation. No. There were no good lines now. The story was writing itself, and she wasn't the hero. Inside the executive lounge, Danielle checked her watch again. Flight 1884 had now been delayed by 22 minutes. She wasn't surprised. When a system is held together by unexamined bias, all it takes is one misjudged woman to bring it to a halt. The boarding door bust. A figure in red approached. Her heels echoed down the hall with authority. Cynthia Reyes stepped into the lounge, flanked by Justin Cole, Horizon's Eastern legal counsel, and a young staffer nervously tapping notes into an iPad. Cynthia didn't need to ask who Danielle was. She felt it. Some people carry power the way others wear suits. Miss Pierce, Cynthia said, extending a hand. I'm Cynthia Reyes. I sincerely apologize for the treatment you've received. Danielle rose slowly. She didn't take the hand. Not yet. Do you know how many times I've been stopped like this? I can't imagine, Cynthia replied truthfully. Then let me help you imagine. She opened her leather bag, pulled out a cream-colored folder, and laid it gently on the table between them. It was the original contract. Horizon's logo. Her signature. The work that had rebuilt their entire first-class food strategy. You've been serving my food on your flights for 3 months. You've been rebuilding your brand on my back. And yet, this morning, I was treated like a counterfeit. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because at that moment, even Cynthia's silence sounded like an apology. Do you want a statement? A tweet? A public acknowledgement? Cynthia asked. Danielle shook her head. No. I want something more difficult. What's that? Danielle's voice dropped. I want change. Not policy change. Not HR memos. I want the next time a woman who looks like me steps into a premium line, she doesn't need to prove herself before she gets treated like a person. Justin Cole shifted uncomfortably. Because this wasn't about terms and conditions. This was about conditioning. Danielle continued. Your people didn't make a mistake. They made a decision. A decision based on habit, pattern, and perception. She looked directly at Brittany through the glass wall. Their eyes met for a split second, and in that moment, Brittany looked away. Not because she was ashamed of being wrong, but because she was afraid of finally seeing how wrong she had been. Inside the lounge, the air was no longer simply still. It was loaded. Like the pause before a courtroom verdict. Like the silence in a boardroom after a deal gets nuked. Danielle Pierce didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke landed like a slow drumbeat on the marble floor beneath them. Across from her, Cynthia Reyes stood tall, but not proud. Not anymore. Because as the head of regional operations, she'd led reform programs, launched diversity workshops, and even spoken at conferences about inclusion in corporate culture. But this wasn't about slides and buzzwords. This was about the woman who had just forced her entire system to stare at itself, without touching a podium, without calling for cameras. And that, Cynthia realized, was more dangerous than any viral scandal. Because it meant this wasn't isolated. It wasn't a headline incident. It was something far older, far quieter, and far more deeply embedded. Danielle leaned forward, her fingers resting gently on the cream-colored folder between them. I don't want a handwritten apology, she said, her voice cool and precise. I don't want a tweet with hashtags or a LinkedIn post about doing better. I want the next Haley to be trained well enough to scan the ticket before they scan the face. There it was. The name. Haley, the real name of the woman standing just outside the glass wall, still pretending to scroll through her computer screen, still hoping that the storm outside the counter would somehow move past her. But this wasn't a storm. It was a mirror, and she was being forced to see herself in it. Cynthia opened her mouth to respond, but Danielle raised a hand, not rudely, but firmly. Let me finish, Danielle said. Because the next woman you dismiss might not be carrying a multi-million-dollar contract in her handbag. She might not have your number saved in her phone. She might just be a teacher, a nurse, a mother. She paused. And when you treat her like a threat instead of a guest, she'll have no boardroom to bring you into. She'll walk away, silently hurt, and you'll never even know you broke something inside her. Cynthia's throat tightened. This wasn't a business conversation anymore. This was a dismantling. And yet, Danielle didn't make it personal. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't humiliate. She simply refused to make it comfortable for the people who needed to sit in that discomfort. In that moment, Justin Cole, the legal director, stepped forward. His face was pale, his collar slightly wrinkled from the sweat of anxiety. "Ms. Pierce, if you'd allow me to offer." "I don't need your offer, Mr. Cole." Danielle looked at him with something deeper than disdain. It was disappointment. "I've read your equity policy. I've seen your press releases about frontline sensitivity training. I even saw the banner at Gate 10 last month. Diversity is our altitude. Nice slogan. Shame it didn't board the plane." Justin couldn't speak. His years of legal language, compliance clauses, and damage control tactics felt like wet paper in the face of a woman who had already beaten the system without raising her voice. Brittany Wells, now frozen behind her screen, felt her chest tighten with every word that slipped through the lounge walls. She wanted to disappear. But the most painful part wasn't being wrong. It was knowing that she never once stopped to consider that she could be. Danielle stood up slowly, gathering her belongings. The boarding gate remained closed. The flight, delayed 32 minutes now, had gone from a logistical delay to a symbolic one. Passengers had started to catch on. They weren't sure what was happening, but they could feel it. She's still not boarded? Something's up. There's a suit from corporate talking to her. VIP situation? No one knew exactly. But every camera was turned. Every phone was subtly angled. The silence surrounding Gate 32 wasn't awkward anymore. It was reverent. Danielle looked at Cynthia one last time. "I'm not here to destroy your airline, but I won't be the reason you avoid the conversation either. What would you have us do?" Cynthia asked, finally allowing her voice to crack just slightly. Danielle exhaled, not out of exhaustion, but as though releasing the weight of an entire generation's disappointment. "Start by reassessing your frontline people, not just by procedure, by mindset. Because if a woman in a suit, holding a valid ticket and a government-issued ID, still looks wrong to someone at your counter, then your bias isn't unconscious. It's systemized." Outside the lounge, Haley Dorsey knew she'd just been seen. Truly seen. Not in a headline. Not in an investigation. But in that way where you realize you just became Exhibit A in a corporate lesson you thought you'd never be part of. Danielle stepped forward, approaching the boarding door. The gate attendant at the door, a young man named Jordan, straightened his jacket, adjusted the name tag, and opened the gate without hesitation. "Miss Pierce," he said, bowing his head slightly. "Welcome aboard. We've been waiting." Danielle nodded, not with pride, but with clarity. Not for the cameras, not for the passengers, but for every woman behind her who had ever been told, "This lane isn't for you." As she walked down the jet bridge, the tension didn't follow her. It stayed behind, inside the lounge, inside Brittany's chest, inside the hush that settled over Gate 32 like a fresh snowfall covering something ugly. Cynthia didn't speak again. She didn't follow Danielle. She just stood there, still, grounded, like someone who just realized she was no longer the highest authority in the room. Because sometimes the loudest change doesn't come from a mic. It comes from a woman who dares to stand still and forces the world to move around her. As Danielle Pierce stepped onto the jet bridge leading to Horizon Air Flight 1884, the world outside the terminal fell away. The murmurs, the stares, the silent audit of whether she belonged, none of it crossed that threshold. What followed her wasn't anger or vengeance. It was truth. And truth doesn't need to shout. At the aircraft door, Jordan, the head flight attendant, stood straighter than he had for any other passenger that morning. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of understanding. "Welcome aboard, Miss Pierce. We've prepared Seat 1A for your comfort. If there's anything you need, please let us know." Danielle nodded, her gaze even, her voice firm but not cold. "Thank you." Jordan didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He had seen the stillness in the boarding area. He had seen the ripple of quiet around her. And most of all, he had seen the email just 15 minutes earlier. VIP alert. Danielle Pierce, CEO of Pierce Harvest Logistics. Provide full discretion. Maximize assistance. Avoid unnecessary communication. He watched as she walked into the cabin. No entourage, no designer luggage, just a structured leather handbag, and the calm presence of someone who had learned long ago that dignity was her best defense. Seat 1A was spotless. The leather shined with a fresh polish. A folded napkin, a sealed bottle of mineral water, and a note card with her name in gold script awaited her. Not because she had requested it, but because the system was finally trying to catch up to her silence. Danielle placed her bag beneath the seat, sat down, and adjusted her neck pillow without fanfare. Her eyes glanced out the oval window, where morning sunlight was just beginning to streak across the Atlanta runway. It was quiet. Almost too quiet, but this time, the silence didn't come from avoidance. It came from reverence. Across the cabin, other first-class passengers pretended not to look. The man in 1C, a lawyer judging by the open case file on his lap, paused mid-scroll. His eyes flicked to Danielle, then back down, then up again. The woman in 2A, dressed in a crisp pantsuit and glossy heels, reached for her blanket with slow precision, as if trying not to draw attention, but her eyes lingered. No one said anything, but everyone felt it. Danielle didn't touch the water. She didn't open her tablet. She didn't cross her legs with drama. She simply sat, spine straight, hands resting calmly in her lap, an embodiment of quiet power. Because what she carried onto that flight wasn't just a handbag and a boarding pass. It was a memory. A memory of being turned away from her first vendor pitch because she looked too young to be a CEO. A memory of being followed through a jewelry store in New Orleans as if her fingertips were more dangerous than her contracts. A memory of her son asking, "Why are they watching us?" when all they had done was enter the lobby of a hotel she'd already paid to host a conference. And now, one more memory, being held back at the gate of the airline whose reputation she had helped rebuild from the ground up. Across the aisle, Jordan returned with a tray. On it was a handwritten card, a silver-wrapped chocolate bar, and a soft cloth napkin. He placed it on her table and spoke just above a whisper. "This is from me and some of the crew. We saw what happened, and we just wanted you to know, not everyone turned away." Danielle looked at the card, but didn't pick it up. She didn't have to. Her eyes softened just slightly, enough to acknowledge the gesture without deflecting its weight. The card read, "Thank you for not staying silent. Because of you, we know when it's time to stand up." No logos. No signatures. Just truth written in pen and courage. Outside the aircraft, the runway bustled as normal. But on the terminal monitors near Gate 32, something unusual was happening. 3 other Horizon flights, scheduled to depart within 40 minutes, now displayed a single-word delay notification, internal reason. Inside Horizon's system, the cause was listed differently, temporary suspension of boarding for frontline review. Cynthia Reyes, now seated in a crisis management room 3 floors above the gate, was overseeing the most unexpected halt in her regional career. Not because of a security breach, not due to weather, but because a single woman made their entire framework look in the mirror. Across from her, Legal Officer Justin Cole spoke in low tones. "We'll need to review every gate camera at JFK and ATL, especially Gate 32. Cynthia didn't look up. "And we'll also need to temporarily remove staff associated with the incident." She nodded. "Start with the one who didn't scan the ticket. Her name's Brittany Wells." Justin exhaled, almost gratefully. "Already suspended pending review." Cynthia's eyes didn't blink. "We're not punishing one mistake. We're acknowledging the culture that made it feel normal." Back on Flight 1884, Jordan leaned slightly toward Danielle one last time before takeoff. "I saw your speech last year," he said, his voice barely audible over the quiet hum of the cabin. "My younger brother heard you talk about traceable agriculture. After that, he quit his job in marketing and went back to help run our grandfather's farm." Danielle looked at him, surprised. "Really?" "Yeah," Jordan smiled, this time with no nervousness. "You made something feel real and worth going back for." For the first time that morning, Danielle allowed herself a small, genuine smile, not triumphant, not for show, just real. Then he's headed in the right direction. The plane pulled back from the gate. The cabin lights dimmed. Danielle turned her gaze back out the window, where sunlight now poured freely across the wing, like a quiet promise that what had happened back there wouldn't be left behind. Because she hadn't shouted, she hadn't recorded anything. She hadn't posted a single word. And yet, the entire airport had stopped. A multimillion-dollar contract hadn't saved her from scrutiny, but her stillness had saved a system from continuing its spiral. As the plane rolled onto the runway, the passengers shifted in their seats. Some dozed, some typed. But in 1A, Danielle Pierce sat silently, her hands folded, her thoughts full, but her dignity untouched. Because sometimes, the most powerful seat on the plane isn't the one with extra legroom. It's the one that reminds the entire system who paid for it to exist in the first place. By the time Horizon Air Flight 1884 broke through the cloud line, slicing across the early morning sky towards San Francisco, the real turbulence was still unfolding 1,800 feet below. Not in the air, but in the mindset of an airline. In a locked conference room on the 10th floor of Hartsfield-Jackson's East Terminal, Cynthia Reyes stood before a projection screen where words were flashing fast. Legal updates, frontline reports, personnel logs, timestamped footage. A message from Justin Cole, the legal director, appeared. Issue no longer isolated. Gate 32 incident has triggered secondary internal reviews at JFK and O'Hare. Staff behavior patterns under scrutiny. Cynthia pressed her hands against the edge of the table. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected a woman to stand still and force an entire transportation system to hit pause. But Danielle Pierce didn't need a camera. She didn't need to yell. She had made silence look like leadership. Across the terminal, boarding at 3 Horizon gates was still halted. No public statement was issued. But the whispers were spreading fast. A janitor pushing a mop near gate 34 muttered to another worker, "They say some lady in first class brought the whole floor to a stop." Over a ticket? Nope, the other man said. Over respect. In the Horizon staff room, a younger boarding agent named Claire was refreshing the internal employee portal. The headline on the admin dashboard read, "Temporary Frontline Freeze, ATL/Northeast Region, Active." Underneath, a staff memo in red text, "Effective immediately, boarding procedures at affected terminals are under review. All ID verification and priority screening actions to be logged manually for oversight." Claire turned to her supervisor, confused. Did something happen? Her supervisor didn't look up. Someone stopped the wrong woman. Back on Flight 1884, the tension had melted into stillness. Passengers weren't talking about what happened. But the absence of conversation said everything. Danielle sat in seat 1A, her arms relaxed, gaze still directed outside the window. She wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't thinking about headlines or viral tweets. She was thinking about her mother, Louise Pierce, the woman who had taught her to wake before the sun, to see past the rind of a fruit and into the heart of the customer, to never let anyone redefine her based on a glance. Danielle smiled faintly as she remembered the scent of wet cardboard and ripened pears from that Cleveland grocery aisle. The feeling of her small hand wrapped around the handle of a produce crate, barely able to lift it, but always trying. Her mother never raised her voice either. And yet, her voice still echoed in Danielle's heart. You don't have to yell to be heard. Just stand where truth can find you. In the seat behind Danielle, a young woman in her early 20s, clearly a junior flight attendant, approached cautiously. Her hands trembled slightly as she held a small tray. A chocolate bar wrapped in silver foil. A handwritten card. A soft cloth napkin. She placed it on Danielle's table and whispered, "From a few of us. We just wanted you to know, not all of us stayed silent." Danielle looked at the tray, then up at the young woman. Her face was bright with sincerity and discomfort, as if she was trying to apologize for a system she didn't build but had still been part of. Danielle gave a small nod. "Thank you." She didn't touch the chocolate. She didn't read the card aloud. She just let it sit there, a gesture that needed no commentary. In Minneapolis, Jack Renault, Horizon's executive director of customer experience, was staring at his phone in disbelief. He had just read the internal summary from Cynthia's team. Passenger, Danielle Pierce. Incident, delay at gate 32. Cause, suspicion despite valid credentials. Contract value, $48 million. Risk, critical. Jack leaned back in his leather chair and closed his eyes. Just 42 days earlier, he had toasted the Fresh Flight campaign with sparkling water and local beet chips, both sourced by Danielle's company. They'd planned commercials, social media videos, a nationwide rollout of sustainable meals. And now? Now the woman who saved them from a PR disaster had been profiled by one of their own staff. "What do we do?" one of his assistants asked. Jack looked up slowly. "Nothing, unless it starts with everything." Back in Atlanta, Horizon's communications director asked Cynthia the same question. "Should we post a public apology? A press release?" Cynthia shook her head. She didn't go public. She didn't post anything. If she had, this would already be national news. "Then we're in the clear?" "No," Cynthia said, her tone hardening. "We're in the spotlight, and it's darker than any headline." Then what does she want? Cynthia thought about it. She remembered Danielle's words, sharp yet composed. "I don't need a tweet. I don't need a handwritten letter. I need something better." And then it hit her. Danielle didn't want words. She wanted change. And the most terrifying part? She was already getting it. Because within 72 minutes of the incident, HR had flagged every employee who failed to log identity verifications properly over the past 90 days. Legal had updated the bias protocol from optional review to mandatory quarterly assessment. 3 directors were scheduling emergency calls with Equity Now, a national civil rights consulting group. Danielle hadn't filed a lawsuit. She hadn't gone on camera. She hadn't raised her voice once. And yet, the whole machine was recalibrating around her silence. At the back of the plane, the head flight attendant Jordan pulled up his internal tablet and typed a quick note. Flight 1884. All cabin crew advised. 1A is not just a seat. It's a message. Back at gate 32, Haley Dorsey, the agent who had first stopped Danielle, was packing her things in silence. Her name was no longer on the schedule. No confrontation. No escort. Just absence. Her colleagues didn't speak. Not out of cruelty, but because they didn't know what to say to someone who had finally seen herself through someone else's pain. In her mind, Haley kept hearing Danielle's words. The next person you treat like an intruder might not have a contract in their pocket. And that was what broke her. Because she had become the gate. And Danielle didn't knock. She simply waited until the door fell off its hinges by itself. The wheels of Flight 1884 touched down in San Francisco with a soft rumble, the kind of gentle landing that pilots pride themselves on. But for Danielle Pierce, seated in 1A with her hands folded over her lap, the true descent had already happened, not in the sky, but in the way the system had dropped into self-reflection. She remained seated while other first-class passengers unbuckled, stood up too fast, reached for bags, called their drivers. Everyone seemed to be in motion, except her. Because Danielle knew, the biggest movement of the day had already happened when she stood still. Jordan, the head flight attendant, waited quietly near the front, not to assist, but simply to witness. When Danielle finally stood, he didn't say, "Have a nice day." Instead, he looked at her with quiet gratitude and whispered, "Thank you. Not for the contract, but for not bowing." Danielle looked at him with warmth in her eyes. For a moment, her composure broke, not with emotion, but with connection. She nodded once, then stepped through the aircraft door and onto the jet bridge. Waiting near the arrival sign was a professional driver holding a placard. "Ms. Pierce, Pierce Harvest Logistics." The black Lincoln sedan waited outside, its engine humming softly. But Danielle didn't reach for the door just yet. Her phone vibrated. First, a message from Maggie. "You've done what a year of DI campaigns couldn't. They're rewriting the entire SOP system. Legal just flagged Gate 32 for operational retraining." Then, an email from Cynthia Reyes. Subject, formal acknowledgement. Body, thank you for your clarity. Internal review is underway. We will not waste this lesson. Respectfully, Cynthia. Then finally, a forwarded link from a small media blog in Georgia. Headline, Black CEO detained at gate. Airline freezes operations in response. Danielle didn't click it. She didn't need to. She knew what they were writing. She knew what people were saying. And most importantly, she knew what needed to be said had already been said, without her ever raising her voice. She opened the door and entered the back seat of the Lincoln. As the driver pulled away, she rolled down the window halfway, letting in the Pacific breeze. Downtown San Francisco shimmered in the distance, but her destination wasn't corporate headquarters or a news studio. It was the Marriott Hotel, where the Western Food Sustainability Summit was already underway. Inside the conference hall, murmurs floated among the attendees. "I heard Danielle Pierce is speaking today. Isn't she the one who got stopped at the airport this morning? I heard Horizon halted their flights over it." But as Danielle entered from the side of the hall, no one clapped. No one stood up. No applause. No spotlight. Just silence. But this silence felt different. IT wasn't avoidance. IT was recognition. She walked up to the stage in her gray jacket and leaf-shaped lapel pin. Pierce Harvest's logo, modest and organic. When the host introduced her name, he fumbled slightly, unsure whether to acknowledge the incident. Danielle just nodded and took the microphone. "I'm not here to talk about what happened this morning," she began. "I'm here to talk about why it was able to happen." The room held its breath. In food systems, we talk a lot about shelf life, about processing speeds, about scaling logistics. But I want to talk about something more dangerous, snap judgment. She paused. You can build the most advanced supply chain in the world. But if someone looks at a human being and decides they don't belong based on their skin, their accent, or their shoes, then what you've built isn't a system. It's a filter, a rotten one. People leaned in. Pens stopped scribbling. Eyes widened. "This morning," she said, "I was asked to show ID for a seat I bought. I was asked to justify my presence. And the person who asked wasn't malicious. She was trained to follow instinct, an instinct shaped by bias. Her voice never rose, but every word cut deeper. You want to change how your companies work? Start by changing how your people see. Not just how they read policy, how they read faces. A woman in the front row, the VP of a grocery chain, dropped her eyes. A logistics lead in the second row uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. It wasn't guilt. It was realization. Danielle concluded with one final sentence. You can't ship integrity in crates. You have to grow it in the gaze. The applause came slowly. Not loud, not performative, but genuine. After the talk, Danielle didn't stay for press questions. She didn't take selfies or give interviews. Instead, as she walked down the side hallway, a man with a gray beard and a logistics badge from Pacific Retail Group approached her. That last line, about growing integrity in the gaze. It'll change how I hire. Thank you. Danielle didn't even slow down. That's enough, she whispered. That's why I stood there. And she kept walking. No camera crew followed. No press release was drafted. But back in Cleveland, in a modest kitchen with a faded clock and a humming fridge, Louise Pierce, now retired, sat reading a small business magazine that had just published a feature. The Quiet Power of Danielle Pierce, the woman who rebuilt a system without a word. Louise set the magazine down. The headline didn't make her smile, but the last line did. She never raised her voice, but the world heard her anyway. She looked at the window, sunlight pouring in, and said softly, "That's my daughter." Meanwhile, at Horizon's headquarters, the internal bulletin flashed a quiet but seismic update, effective immediately. Gate 32 closed for retraining. All frontline staff to undergo bias certification. Equity now contracted for 12-month internal audit. Public apology? Not yet. Internal change? Already underway. Danielle never needed to make it public, because the people who saw it couldn't unsee it. And at Gate 32, 3 weeks later, a new sign quietly replaced the old boarding lane label. First class boarding, all are welcome. Verified by action, not appearance. No applause had been given to Danielle, because she didn't need it. Her story didn't require applause, just action. And that, finally, was underway.